And now we will go to our third presentation about translating reference doses into allergen management practice. And this will be presented by René Crevel. René is a science leader at the Unilever Safety Environmental Assurance Center. Here he is responsible for advice and guidance on food allergy and allergen risk assessment and management, and for leading Unilever's food allergy research program. He qualified initially in mammalian physiology and has postgraduate qualifications in immunology and toxicology. René is also the chair of the Food Allergy Task Force at ILSI Europe. René, it is your turn now. I give you the control.
Thank you very much. Hello.
Yep.
Right. Thank you very much, Roland. Let me just get my presentation. Oops. Oh, where is my presentation? Yes, there we are. Okay. Yeah, show my screen. Yeah, thank you very much, Roland, for this introduction, and thank you very much to the audience also for taking part and listening to our webinar. Now, you've heard now. You should now have a very good understanding of how far we've come in terms of risk assessment for allergens from the presentations by Geert and Joe. What I'm going to talk about is the subject of the third paper which have been shown, which is translating reference doses into allergen management practice. Oops. The challenges, and in particular, focusing on the challenges for stakeholders. Whoops. Yeah. The way I've structured my presentation is, first of all, to reiterate the goals of the framework, then to take you through the understanding the model outputs, highlighting what they can tell you and what they can't tell you as well, because that's important. Then setting risk management in the public health context, in particular in terms of setting the risk management objectives, individual versus population risk, the nature of the adverse effects, and feasibility and practicality. Then we, at the workshop and in the paper, we make a lot of stress on risk communication, the importance of risk communication, and I'll talk about that too. And I'll finish with stakeholder perspectives and a little bit of a look ahead in future perspectives. So what are the goals of the framework which you've heard about? Basically, they are to provide a consistent, agreed and harmonized and transparent approach to precautionary allergen labeling, which to date has been lacking. In doing that, and the reason for this is to improve the value of precautionary allergen labeling to allergic consumers. At the same time, hopefully reducing, but at least not increasing its use. That's another challenge. And also, while doing all that, and that is related to the second point, maintaining accessibility to an appropriate range of foods for people with food allergies, both sufficient in number and at an appropriate price, something that perhaps is not always stressed. Now, thinking about the model outputs, they are really critical to understand in the risk management context. You'll be familiar with this description of risk as being a function of hazard and exposure, with a consideration of the nature of the effects, in other words, severity really in this particular context. And now what you will also know, I'm sure, is actually that the public health concern relates as much to the nature of the effects as just, or perhaps more sometimes than just the numbers affected, particularly with the wide range of effects which range from barely perceptible to full-blown anaphylaxis in the case of food allergy. The model, the output that you get from the models that have been described is actually a number of reactions predicted assuming exposure to a defined amount of allergen. First thing to note actually is it's not thresholded. So if there's any concentration of allergen, you will actually get some reactions predicted. Whether those reactions actually turn out in practice or not is another question. There often many of them, depending on obviously the dose, are well below the doses which have been shown to provoke reactions, the lowest doses which have been shown to provoke reactions in individuals. More importantly, it does not discriminate between reactions of different severity. So in the model, actually, anaphylaxis has the same weight as basically a rash or mild rash. So basically the model outputs reflect sensitivity, low minimum eliciting dosage, rather than reactivity, which I mean to mean nature or severity of the reaction. So we've got a data gap here, which we need to bear in mind, which isn't actually to detract from the importance of the modelling, which actually has brought us a long way, but actually is just to highlight where we need to be working in the future as well. Now, in terms of the risk management in the public health context, we need to be very clear about the objectives. What is desirable, what is possible, and what are the quantitative and qualitative aspects of the risk. This will define the risk assessment approach and questions. And the reason I've put this graph, which perhaps several of you have seen before, actually is to illustrate that. Clearly, if you had a very low reference dose, if you could set a very low reference dose, in theory, you would be protecting people extremely well, allergic people extremely well. However, in practice, that doesn't work because you end up with an awful lot of products labeled with precautionary allergen labeling, as a result of which it gets disregarded. People don't bother with the label, don't believe the label, and as a result, you end up with a risk profile shown by the red line on the graph. So that's just one particular illustration. Now, again, taking forward this the risk management and the importance of objectives, we need to think about individual versus population risk. Basically, the modeling actually predicts, of course, population risk. It can't really indicate to an individual, an allergic individual, whether they are or not going to react. And in fact, many of them, of course, will believe themselves to be in the potentially reactive. So it's important to get across the significance at the individual level. And clearly also the tolerability of the residual risk, both societally and individually. And we know that certainly societally and probably also individually, there is great concern about risks which are fairly rare, but which are accompanied by serious consequences. Anaphylaxis would be a good example. It's relatively rare, particularly in life-threatening form, but of course that is one of the big concerns, and we need to address that in our risk management objectives. And again, we need to be transparent about the communication of that risk in the context of individual risk assessments. Nature of the adverse effects, of course, is critical, and dose is critical, although how much weight is given is currently a matter of debate, but it's critical. The greater the dose, we know the greater the proportion of people who are going to react. But we also know that, or at least I think that actually the more likely a severe reaction is, the higher the dose. What we're not saying actually, of course, is that everybody will go to the right-hand side. Everybody in the allergic population, if given a sufficient amount of allergen, will go to the right-hand side. That's a different question. But the likelihood, I think, is greater. We know those adverse effects are also modulated by other factors such as exercise, stress, infection, and many others. Another consideration, as I mentioned before, is feasibility and practicality, and we need to consider both the technical aspects, operational aspects. How is it possible to produce food products within particular specifications, but also, as Geert and Joe have already mentioned, verification, which can be quite challenging. And then we need to think about the socioeconomic costs, both costs and other legitimate factors such as waste, sustainability, and so on. I mentioned risk communication is critical, but risk communication isn't just me telling somebody, an allergic consumer, what the output is. It's more of an iterative and interactive process, and we tried to do that within our expert group. Actually, it's not unidirectional, and it needs to involve all interested parties at different stages. And of course, it needs to be transparent and honest, and that is critical to establishing what a tolerable risk is. Now, we know that currently the risk associated with allergens is communicated both for allergen ingredient labeling, and I think basically the consensus is probably that it's fairly effective. There's probably improvement that can be made, but that's not the big issue. The big issue, as you've already heard, is precautionary allergen labeling, which is not functioning properly at present. There's too much of it still. There are no common standards for application. Of course, the work we've done aims to develop that standard, to propose that standard, and it's confusing, and because there are no common standard, it's confusing to consumers. It's also confusing to healthcare practitioners who have to advise consumers. So basically, it lacks credibility among many, leading to taking risks, them taking risks. So moving on from that now to stakeholder perspectives, which we heard about at the workshop and throughout the work of the expert group as well. Well, clearly allergic consumers have an expectation of safety. That I think is what one would expect. But it is critical to communicate the framework effectively. They want to understand what reference doses mean in practice. They want to understand how likely they are to have a reaction which is going to be severe. And they want to know how those reference doses relate to thresholds and their chance of a reaction. And as I mentioned before, transparency is a critical element. Now, healthcare practitioners who need to advise allergic consumers welcome the framework because it provides a consistent and harmonized application of precautionary allergen labeling, and it should help to improve advice to people with food allergies. And hopefully it will help them to provide differentiated advice according to the history of allergy. And their understanding of the risk assessment, of course, is a critical element, and hopefully it will actually remove the current situation where you can have diametrically opposite advice given about whether to observe or not precautionary allergen labeling to allergic consumers. Moving on now to other stakeholders. Industry, well, unintended allergen presence is going to remain an issue to be managed for the foreseeable future, in part because, of course, factories can't be redesigned overnight. There are many limitations to that, among other things, which I won't go into. So, because unintended allergen presence is going to remain an issue, precautionary allergen labeling will also continue to be needed. And our industrial stakeholders thought the framework had several positive features, in particular the evidence-based benchmarks and the common risk assessment approach. But they also foresaw some interesting and important challenges, such as in verification. Are the analytical tools that we've got up to the job? For start, Joe referred to that briefly as well. It's a question that needs to be addressed. And then, of course, meeting the benchmarks, which are stringent, I think, while reducing the extent of precautionary allergen labeling is certainly going to be challenging.